Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is March 11th, 2009, and my guest is Dani Rodrik, the Rafi Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Dani, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. Thanks for your interest.
Our topic today is globalization and its impact, and I want to start by quoting from a recent paper that you wrote with Margaret Macmillan. You say, quote, "Clearly, globalization has facilitated technology transfer and contributed to efficiencies in production. Yet the very diverse outcomes we observe among developing countries suggest that the consequences of globalization depend on the manner in which countries integrate into the global economy. In several cases, most notably China, India, and some other Asian countries, globalization's promise has been fulfilled. High productivity employment opportunities have expanded, and structural change has contributed to overall growth. But in many other cases, in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, globalization appears not to have fostered the desirable kind of structural change. Labor has moved in the wrong direction from more productive to less productive activities, including, most notably, informality." So let's talk, end of quote. So talk first about what you mean by structural change and its relationship to productivity.
In the paper itself, the measure of structural change that I'm using is one that is based on a 9-sector disaggregation of the entire economy. So that means I have all of agriculture in one sector, all of manufacturing as one sector, all of, say, minerals as one sector, the government sector in one sector, and a bunch of other service sectors. So it's very broad patterns of structural change that I'm focusing on. Going back to a very early tradition in development economics that goes back to really Sir Arthur Lewis's work in the 1950s when he developed these models of the dual economy, and he defined the process of economic development as one where basically labor moves from the more traditional parts of the economy, typically traditional agriculture, to more modern, more productive parts, typically urban sectors, but industry as a leading modern sector. So I wanted to see, what has happened to that idea, to what extent this process still captures what's going on in the developing world, and there were some surprises, which you mentioned in the quote that you gave.
But that transition from rural to urban is going on all over the world, right? It's definitely happening in massive amounts in China.
Right.
It's definitely happening in large amounts in India. Is that the general direction also in Latin America and Africa?
That has, to a large extent, that is true. I mean, I think last year was the first year when the total number of people in the world that were in urban areas exceeded the number of people in rural areas. So there's generally a trend toward urbanization. That is for sure. There are countries in our sample where that is not happening, including at least one African country, surprisingly. But it is that is in general the trend that is happening. What we are capturing, however, is the fact that some of the countries in our sample are able to increase employment in some of the more productive parts of the urban sectors, whether those are some of the more whether it's the manufacturing sector or it is some services that are closely linked with the manufacturing sector, and those are countries where the structural tends to promote overall productivity because the economy's resources are moving in the right direction. And there are other cases where if you look only at, for example, how manufacturing has done in a lot of Latin American countries, you walk away with the impression that it's been quite an extraordinary performance. In fact, that is one of the most surprising things in this paper, because a lot of the work that has focused on the performance of specific industries in Latin America, for example, during the period since 1990, when the region opened up to globalization, had looked at how manufacturing had fared in response to opening up to trade. And there's a very common finding in this literature, which is that the firms that the productivity increased tremendously, and it increased more the more subject individual industries within manufacturing were subject to the forces of international competition, which sort of stands to reason. But what this literature hadn't looked at, is sort of the fact that in many of these manufacturing sectors, increases in productivity takes place through technological upgrading, through increased capital accumulation, and not employment increases. Often, in fact, employment shrinks. So we get this phenomenon of rationalization. So part of the increase in productivity is due to the rationalization of production. Now, this wouldn't be a problem if the labor that's displaced from these rapidly productivity increasing firms would go to other productive parts of the economy, but that's really what hasn't happened, and that's what our research shows, that there has been a massive movement in the wrong direction from these more productive, more open parts of the economy to the less productive services.
Just to recap for a minute, if you see in some aggregate sense that productivity is growing, it could be because there's more output, but what we often are going to care about is output per worker, and if output per worker is growing dramatically because of investments in technology and capital, but actually the number of workers could be falling because of the productivity of capital. The question is, what do those displaced workers do? And in a developed country, and I want to come back occasionally to talk about contrasts and similarities in your stories with a developed country, we often talk about the virtues of creative destruction. So new technology comes along, it becomes cheaper, more efficient, produce some good, and the new workers go find something else to do, and total output expands. There's more choice, more variety, lower prices, higher standard of living, et cetera. So the question is, how well do labor markets work? Part of the question. In these different economies, where do those workers go? And so what do we know about that? Where do displaced workers go when these economies become more productive?
I mean, first of all, as you say, I think this distinction between what seems to be happening in the developed countries and what's happening in the developing countries is very, very important. There has been tremendous amount of structural change in the advanced countries as well. In particular, manufacturing employment has shrunk as a share of total employment in pretty much in all industrial countries. Now, this in itself, isn't reflected in overall reduced growth in productivity for the economy, because people who are employed, who are displaced from manufacturing in the rich countries, don't necessarily go to sectors where their productivity is significantly lower.
Could be a little lower.
Could be a little lower, but there's a chart in the paper which shows that the intersectoral variation in labor productivity tends to significantly come down over the course of development. So these intersectoral, the intersectoral variation in labor productivity is huge in the developed countries, in the developing countries, in particular the lowest income among them. And if you look at what happens to those intersectoral, like the coefficient of variation of these labor productivities across different sectors, and by the time you look at the rich countries, the gaps have really shrunk. The key is, as you say, why is it that these gaps aren't being equalized? But you can turn this question on its head and say that, well, this is the big question about development. Because in every developing country, you have a whole bunch of activities that are actually very productive. The problem is that they're a very tiny part of the economy. Yeah. And the question is, why isn't labor and other resources moving sufficiently rapidly into those activities?
All right, so give the example, tell the story of Malawi that you give in the paper, if you can, off the top of your head. about the mining sector
Well,
as an example.
The mining sector. Here is a sector that is very capital intensive, and therefore labor productivity is very high. In fact, so high in Malawi that it matches output per worker in the U.S. economy as a whole. So, in fact, if you could stuff all of Malawi's labor force into the mining sector, Malawi would be as rich as the United States is. But of course, you can't, and nor would it really necessarily make sense to have the mining sector employ all those workers because of the amount of capital it would require. But the fact is that the workers that you cannot get into mining end up in either in agriculture, informal activities, petty trade, where their productivity is really just a tiny fraction of what it is in mining.
Let me ask a more basic question about productivity generally, because the Malawi example, I think, brings it out. If you look at many manufacturing facilities in the United States, a very small number of workers in any one facility are producing enormous amounts of output. The two industries I've looked at are factories I've actually toured in one case, pencil manufacturing and the egg production of chickens. In both of those industries, the number of people involved has shrunk dramatically in the United States. And, of course, some of those jobs have left the United States. But there's still quite a bit of production and of chicken eggs in the United States, right, because they're hard to ship. So in those facilities, a very small number of workers produce 1 billion eggs or more a year. And there's a temptation to say they're very productive, those workers. And they are in the sense of average productivity. But it's really not the workers that are productive. It's the machinery that is smart and allows a relatively unskilled worker to work in that factory and look like the source of the productivity. In fact, what's really going on is that the labor embedded in the machinery is where the productivity lies. And the workers are there mainly just to see that the machinery doesn't break down. They don't really do anything other than keep an eye on things. Right. And so when you think about Malawi, it's not – so even though the productivity might be very high relative to the United States, those workers themselves are not particularly skilled or productive. I assume they're working with unbelievably skilled technology and machinery that could be done by anybody, but many, many types of people. So their true marginal product is not very high.
Well, they're not. I mean, it depends. I mean, but in principle, if these economies were working like textbook market economies, and I said earlier that sort of the big puzzle is why these gaps aren't closing. So what the gaps that ought to be closing are really gaps in terms of the marginal value product of labor, right? So if these markets in these economies worked well, and if the governments didn't impose artificial impediments on labor moving across sectors, then what we would expect is that that wages and value marginal product of labor would be equalized across different sectors. Now, of course, that might mean that at the margin, it would be beneficial for the mining sector in some sense to want to expand and hire more workers, given the huge gap that there is in wages between what effectively they pay in mining and what they pay in the other sectors. And so that, but I think there's a difference here between mining where, it has, precisely because it's so capital intensive and it depends so much on a particular resource, it has limited employment absorption capacity.
You don't want to if you quadrupled your mining by adding labor and capital, you'd lower the productivity perhaps very dramatically because you wouldn't be able to sell it at the market price.
Exactly.
You'd had before.
So that's the sense in which I think the mining example, the Malawian mining example, is really only interesting in terms of the orders of magnitude, but it's not as a counterfactual, as a realistic counterfactual for what the Malawian economy ought to look like. The more interesting question is with respect to sectors that that they can expand. So you look into an economy like Ethiopia, and And it's surprising that many things that ought to be produced and could be produced in Ethiopia are actually not being produced. There are sort of matches. If are being imported from Kenya, cardboard boxes are being imported from other countries. Now, there's no reason why Ethiopia cannot actually produce these things. And that little factories that produce simple consumer goods like that would hire workers and pay them wages that are multiple of what those workers can produce in agriculture. Yet there is something in these economies that you don't get these new industries from taking off, and that prevents these industries from expanding sufficiently to absorb more labor.
How much of that is due to what we would sometimes call red tape, barriers to starting companies? Hernando de Soto has done work on this, obviously. I think the World Bank's done extensive work on it. And they find that in many poor countries, it's extremely difficult to start a new enterprise. Yeah. Is that part of the story, a big part, almost all of it? Any idea?
Well, the big question here is, and you can think about why this transformation, why these gaps aren't closed. You can have two kinds of explanations. One is, government failures. Governments are screwing things up, and red tape would be a clear, example of that. Others mention sort of corruption, right? Right, sure. If you're operating petty trade, it's the government cannot come and tax you the moment you actually have a workshop somewhere, fix the boat, and then you're subject to the government taxing you, the inspectors coming and asking for bribes and so forth, and you might figure it's not really worth your while. And in more generally, sort of property rights and sort of the overall enforcement of contracts and
rule of law.
And the rule of law, right? I mean, if there's no rule of law, then you're okay working as a barber on the corner store, because everything you need is all in person. On the basis of personal relationships, you don't have to buy a lot of inputs. You don't have to deal with customs. You don't have to deal with tax inspectors all that much. So all these problems with the government and the legal and contractual environment clearly impose disproportionate costs on the modern parts of the economy compared to the traditional part. So that's one reason why the modern part is underdeveloped. So that's sort of under the rubric of government failures. But I think often, market failures are very important as well. And those market failures are things like coordination failures. I mean, if you want to operate, I mentioned a cardboard, factory. Okay, then you need high quality paper, or you need, highly skilled, particular kind of workers who are used to showing up at work and doing a good job, and so you need all kinds of complementary, inputs and arrangements around you for this to make sense. You have pineapples, but you don't have pineapple canning, and then you say, okay, I can export this, but in order for you to be able to think of exporting canned pineapples, you need the national airline or some airline to have cargo service, and they're not going to establish the cargo service until they see a demand for it, and it's a chicken and egg problem. And there are all kinds of learning externalities as well. That there is a problem of what we call cost discovery, which is that the first investor who invests in, let's say, the cardboard factory, provides a very valuable signal to other potential investors as to whether the cost structure of the economy is conducive to producing cardboards or not. But if you end up being a failure, all the costs are private. If you're successful, then you're sending a positive signal. Then you cannot fully internalize all the benefits of that because others come in on the basis of that valuable signal. So there are learning externalities, coordination externalities under the sort of the general rubric of market failures. Now, so the list is long of why these gaps exist and they don't close sufficiently rapidly. Obviously, the trick in specific contexts is trying to figure out which are, the most binding constraint in any particular setting. And sometimes it'll be market failures, and sometimes it'll be government failures. And I can give you examples of both.
Go ahead.
Well, a few years ago we were in El Salvador, an economy which had really done tremendous amount in terms of just liberalizing its economy, privatizing, stabilizing. There was nothing essentially wrong that you can point to in terms of the contractual legal environment, and sort of, it wasn't a government that was just sort of hell bent on taxing everything. Quite to the opposite. And nothing except for garments had taken off. And garments had taken off because of some special trade privilege in the U.S. market. But nothing except for that was going on. You ask people, if I give you $25 million, what would you invest in the Salvadoran economy? And they would think about it for a little bit and then say, well, can I put it in Miami? Do I have to invest in El Salvador? Yeah. That's the kind of environment where, it's really, when you don't, see any Schumpeterian rents, because we forget that when we think about Schumpeterian rents, we think it's just it's about the rich countries. So rich countries, Schumpeterian rents are important for innovators because, they get a new product and they need to sort of ensure that they have at least some rents from investing in those highly costly, risky activities. But in developing countries too, there are, you need Schumpeterian rents for, investors be willing to go into very different new areas, modern industries.
Capital likes to get a return.
Exactly.
Investors
and when it's risky and when there are, huge spillovers to the rest of the economy, the private return is going to be way below what the social return is. So you're not going to get the right kind of transformation. So in that kind of a setting, it's not government failure that's blocking transformation. It's just a bunch of market failures associated with low levels of income. And there, actually, you think the government, you do want the government to come in and actually do some, stimulating.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I'm a little bit skeptical of that terminology, calling that a market failure. It's very uncertain. Yeah. You could say the same thing in the United States. You gave me $25 million. I wouldn't put it in Miami, by the way. I'd think, where's the best place to put it? And of course, it's not clear. If you're making me put one bet down, as opposed to investing in, the equivalent statement to putting it in Miami would be, I'll put it in an index mutual fund. That's also not much of an answer, right? So if you say I had to put a bet down on a particular company or a particular sector, well, it's hard to know.
Right.
So that uncertainty is inherent in any economic situation.
Right.
But I agree that it's qualitatively different and obviously quantitatively different in a poor country. In a poor country, the decision's hard for a different reason. In a rich country, it's hard because everything's pretty similar. It still could make a mistake, but the expectation's fairly similar. There could be an enormous return, as you point out, that's waiting if I could just knew which leap to take, which direction. Is it cardboard boxes? Is it something else? And it's certainly not clear the government could do it any better.
Well, you're right that, it's part of it is just the uncertainty, but my story goes beyond the uncertainty because, as you say, if it's just uncertainty, there's actually no market failure. The market failure arises from the fact that there is no way that the pioneer investor in a new area can recoup the full social return that it generates. So the parallel that you want to think of is this. In a rich country, we have a patent system that says that if you come up with a new product, we are going to allow you to earn monopoly rents from this product. Why? Well, because if the knowledge that you generate becomes freely available to all, then you earn no rents on this product, and then you lose all the investment in R&D that you made. And therefore, the competitive level of profits isn't enough to pay you for the investment in R&D. So we need to give you some rents. So the patent system is meant to overcome this market imperfection in a market for knowledge. I think that the parallel in the developing country is that when we're talking about firms in El Salvador, let's say, who are not going to be investing in new high-tech products, but they're going to be investing in new products that are new to their own economy. And that provides exactly the same kind of learning spillovers that a new product in a rich country does. So the first investor, for example, that sets up a call center, let's say in Jamaica, and points to Jamaica as a potential area where you can successfully run call centers for the universe of all potential firms, investors in the world. That initial pioneer investor has provided huge amount of social surplus to Jamaica, and I think it does make sense for Jamaica to want to subsidize the initial investor in that. And often, those investments will not pay. It's just the nature of this, because this is all based on the idea that some of these investments will actually not work out. So some of these will be mistakes. But the economic logic of this is that you want to subsidize the incumbent investors in new areas.
Okay, well, I disagree. I'm going to make one more attempt. You can counter back, but I think we ought to move on. The reason I disagree is that, first of all, there's a marginal and an inframarginal decision there. One is to open a call center at all, and the second is how big to make it. Of course, you don't know. Either of those is uncertain. You don't know whether opening a call center is going to pay off, and you don't know whether it should be a big one or a small one, how much to invest. But it's very easily the case that if the return is very high, there's uncertainty. Yes, that part we've agreed you can't get rid of. But if the return is very high, it's true you won't capture all the return. There's even a bigger return beyond that to other investors because they learn that Jamaica has, a skilled labor force, and you're taking a chance on that, and you're giving evidence that that's the case. Or you're giving evidence, say, about the reliability of the Jamaican government to keep its promises. There's a lot of different aspects and margins that these decisions could be relevant for, right, and could provide information beyond just your narrow amount. But if you make an enormous amount, the fact that you don't capture all of it, the fact that there's spillovers doesn't really mean that there should be. There's no implication that you need a subsidy to do it. It just means you don't capture all of it. Now it's true you might not make as big a decision, the right size decision, but even if that's true, and even if I'm wrong about this, I still don't see how a government subsidy to that call center is going to be a good idea, given that the government's probably going to use political motivations in setting that subsidy, and there's no reason to think they're going to make the right decision.
Well, I mean, let's take the first point first. You made 2 points. One is that it didn't make sense economically. The other is that even if it did,
it's empirical.
Politically, it's not going to work out. I think economically the argument is this. You're right that to the extent that the investor subsequently earns some degree of extra normal profit, then he's willing to engage in the sort of the search cost on behalf of others who don't necessarily have to incur that search cost. But think about a call center. That's a competitive industry. So the initial investor who's going to try to figure out whether Jamaicans are actually really suitable for providing that service in the call center is actually incurring an investment. Then if he is successful, if subsequent investors can just come in and just bid his workers away, and this being a competitive industry, he can only look forward to normal profits subsequently, then he has no incentive coming in. So if there is enough extra profits for some reason, which happens for another market imperfection, right? If the markets aren't sufficiently competitive. So you can rely on markets not being sufficiently competitive to provide those incentives for the incumbents. But these developing countries are getting into the kinds of areas where they're competing with everybody. Margins are small. So you can't rely on these investments. The guy who's going to be providing canned pineapples to the U.S. market, or the investors in call centers, or the guys who are producing cut flowers. All new industries in these kinds of settings, necessarily to earn extra supernormal profits once they come in. And yet, from the perspective of the economy, they generate huge social surplus because once you demonstrate that cut flowers can be profitably grown in, let's say, Ethiopia, you have an area of employment where productivity is much larger than where it was elsewhere. I think there is a good economic reason for if the problem that's blocking these rise of new industries is what I've called these cost discovery externalities that you want to subsidize. But you want to subsidize, if the logic is this, you want to subsidize just the incumbents. What I think a lot of governments then go on and do wrong is to actually just subsidize a lot of copycats as well, which, given the logic given the economic logic I just laid out, of course, you want to subsidize only the incumbent. I mean, the initial investor, not the subsequent ones. But this is only one of the economic arguments about why you may want to use, certain kinds of industrial policy. Now, the second argument about, whether you can do it or not, whether it gets sort of, political motives to get in or not, it's a huge. I'm happy to talk to you about that. I don't know if you want to, though. So tell me if you want to take it.
Well, let's move to something related, and if it's, and you can bring some of those ideas in. I think the most striking point in the paper, and I think the central issue really facing the debate of globalization today, is we have these two incredible success stories of China and India. We have some smaller but still dramatic successes, and most of them in Asia. What do we understand about what they're doing right and what other countries perhaps are doing wrong? Or again, it could just be structural, internal to the nature of the country, but some of it's policy related, obviously. Why is it that it's so? What do we know about why it's so different? If we know anything, do we know anything about that?
I mean, I'll put forth a hypothesis, and I think it's consistent with the story in the paper. But I think it's a story that requires more empirical substantiation. But it's a story that I find in line with what I see. You need to compare the way in which China opened itself up to the world economy and globalized with the way that Latin America did. Latin America did it in a way that was fully consistent with our standard trade theory. Standard trade theory says you lower your tariff barriers. Your import competing firms that are not sufficiently productive shrink. And the labor that's released from those industries go to a whole bunch of other places, including, notably, your export-oriented industries where you have comparative advantage in, where their productivity at the margin is going to be higher. So, in fact, you get, from opening up to the world economy, that's what standard trade theory predicts, you get an overall higher level of labor productivity in the economy because you're reducing misallocation. Now, if this story doesn't work quite in this way because of all the problems we've discussed just now, which is that there are certain obstacles, whether they're market failures or whether they're government failures, that prevent the sufficiently rapid rise of new industries where you are going to be really competitive. Then what happens is what we observe in Latin America, which is that the import competing industries, true, they have to become more competitive, so they do shrink. But the labor that's released doesn't necessarily end up in industries that are significantly more productive. And that's exactly what we observe in the data. That's what we've called sort of this, growth reducing structural change. Now, how China differs from this pattern is that they have opened up very differently. They have opened up at the margin. So look at the structure of the economy in China. Let's say in the 1980s when they began to open up. They had a whole bunch of state enterprises operating relatively inefficiently behind barriers to trade and huge support from the state. Now, the standard strategy for liberalization would have been to tell them just remove those barriers, remove those supports.
Stand on your own 2 feet, yeah.
Right, and then you create these new industries. That's not how they've opened up. How they've opened up is they kept all those industries in place, all those supports in place, but they created at the margin incentives for new investments in export-oriented areas. So they created the special economic zones. They created all kinds of subsidies for exports into new non-traditional products at the margin. So they turned towards world markets without pulling the rug from underneath these sort of industries with medium level of productivity when you look at the economy as a whole. See, these state enterprises aren't as productive as firms in the special economic zones, but they're still much more productive than the rural areas or, doing petty trade. So that's the problem that they have avoided, which Latin America has not.
So then I guess the question would be, I'm not an expert on China. I don't know how much you know about it, but how much of China's employment growth in urban areas, which has been extraordinary, right? We're talking hundreds of millions of people in the last 15, 20 years, right? Mm-hmm. Moving from rural activity to urban activity. How much of that is new enterprises either started domestically or by foreign investment, right? Because that's the thing that's not happening with the displaced workers in Latin America and Africa. Yeah. Do we have any idea?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you
as opposed to the expansion of existing ones that are already kind of doing stuff.
Right. Now, I can't tell you in terms of numbers of enterprises, but I mean, but it is clear that what has happened, for example, that for example, the share of employment in manufacturing has steadily increased in China, way beyond. It's only recently has begun to shrink. Whereas in Latin America, for example, it began to shrink prematurely. So if you look at sort of cross-country benchmarks in terms of what happens to employment in manufacturing over the course of development, what you experienced in countries like Latin America is a premature deindustrialization. And in China, if anything, the other way around. So what I can tell is that China managed to provide incentives for the growth of its manufacturing enterprises. Now, we know that there's a huge amount of new entry. So, but I can't give you a specific number on that in a comparative perspective.
But as you point out, it's such an interesting way to think about it. We can think about differences between sectors having different productivities within a country, but of course we can also think across countries. And one of the things that's happened in the last 15 years is the extraordinary opportunity to profitably produce things in China is sucking capital and technology into China away from Brazil, away from African countries that might have produced those things, and instead, plus, and there are some externalities of shipping and infrastructure that China is able to either create or has had before. So as a result, productivity increases there are driving the flow of capital there. And now, as you point out, it's finally gotten to the point where those are being exhausted. Right. And we're seeing a decrease in Chinese manufacturing employment as a percentage of the total because as technology continues to improve, you don't need as many people to make the stuff.
Right.
What is that? But that's a very depressing, of course, every poor nation struggling to deal with this that used to be a manufacturing center. Mexico, I think, is having a tough time. They're close to the United States, which is a great advantage, but they're not as cheap as China. So they've got to offset that price difference with the transportation savings, and they can't always do that. So it still raises the question, given that the world's an increasingly dynamic place, you want to make it easy as you can for innovative, creative people, whether they're your own citizens or others, to find ways to employ people, start enterprises.
Absolutely. And the problem is that many of these sort of enterprises where, countries of Africa or Latin America are being successful aren't generating a lot of employment. So this is precisely the problem. I think, there's another side to all of this, which is the role of the exchange rate. I mean, I say that there is no better industrial policy than an undervalued currency, and this is one thing that the Latin American countries have systematically gotten wrong, including most notably Mexico. One thing that has repeatedly happened in countries that have let their currencies float and have basically had monetary policy regimes that say, we don't care where the exchange rate goes, that's just a market-determined variable. Then you open up your capital account, money comes in, your currency appreciates, and it basically kills new investments at the margin in tradable industries, in particular in manufacturers, and that's what's happened throughout Latin America. Asian countries have been very careful to prevent that from happening. Of course, maybe China has gone overboard with undervaluing its currency, but it's in terms of just this business of promoting new industries, I think part of it is industrial policy, and we can discuss how effective that is. But part of it is really a competitive currency, because you mentioned before that industrial policy has the problem that it becomes politicized very quickly. Then you figure out who you're going to select and so forth. The beauty of the exchange rate undervaluation is that it's across the board. You don't have to pick. You basically, if your currency is undervalued by 10%, all tradable industries are being subsidized across the board by 10%. And I think that's that helps a lot. Furthermore, when your currency is overvalued because of capital inflows and so forth, no amount of industrial policy can really undo the effect of that, because like a 20% overvaluation of your exchange rate, there's no way you're going to overdo it. I mean, to undo it or compensate for it by microeconomic policies. So those things microeconomic policies can get very easily swamped by these macro prices. So that, again, I think has been a very big difference between Asia and Latin America. So what happens in Latin America is that they get locked into a pattern of specialization that's much more intensive in natural resources and primary products. Those sectors don't generate a whole lot of employment. And
they also generate a lot of political rent-seeking.
They're bad for governance. They're bad for politics for that reason. And so it's a lousy dynamic. I don't think it was all that preordained that China, or for that matter, other countries in the region like Asia and Taiwan before, would have necessarily ended up being manufacturing powerhouses. They decided to become manufacturing powerhouses, and they became successful at it.
Yeah, I think, again, I think it's somewhat misleading. I think what's really happened is that the technology is driving that, right? It's not that China got good at making things. They allowed people to bring in the capital that made their citizens the vehicle for that change. Friend of mine's involved in the retail clothing business. He said 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, a sweater factory in China was a bunch of women with knitting needles. And there's a limit to how productive you can be with a pair of knitting. You can go a little faster, but the room for improvement's relatively small. And that's not how they make sweaters in China anymore. Yeah. They make them with the same machinery they would use, I suspect that they would use in South Carolina, if to the extent we still have a few textile factories in South Carolina. I don't think we have any sweater factories, but let me ask you one question about the currency thing, because I'm agnostic to skeptical about it, and then I want to turn to some other questions related to the United States. The United States, people claim that the Chinese currency undervaluations hurt manufacturing jobs, and China's strategic use of currency is helping them and hurting us. Seems like a strange argument for us. Again, we can maybe talk about whether it's different for Ethiopia, but for the United States, if they're subsidizing their currency and making our stuff cheap for us to buy, we're getting a big improvement in the price level that allows us to have a larger accumulation of material stuff. That's an increase in our standard of living. True, it displaces workers potentially in manufacturing, but our labor market does work pretty well. They get put into other things, and basically that is going to be good for the United States on average. I can understand how in Mexico it might not be if their labor market doesn't work very well. But it seems like the right answer to that is try to improve their labor market and not try to get into a currency war.
Well, I mean, I think you're largely right about the United States in normal circumstances. Given that labor markets work well, given that there aren't huge discrepancies in labor labor productivities at the margin across different types of economic activities, you might say, well, the structure of production in the United States is relatively immaterial. It doesn't matter. And if China wants to give us huge terms of trade gains by selling us goods,
if they want to give us clothes for almost free, fine. Toys,
right? And
seems good.
And moreover, since labor markets there don't work that well, and there are huge gaps between productivity in the manufacturing and the rural sector, with the reserve, huge amounts of reserve army of workers and surplus workers in China. For them, the structure of production does matter. So it actually from a global standpoint, it's a welfare, efficiency enhancing policy for them.
Those two countries. Yeah.
So now that makes perfect sense. I think up until the point where you get in the United States and has a 9% unemployment rate, and then you have to start asking the question, to what extent that is still true. So there's that question about what happens, whether, if you believe that there is some element of Keynesian unemployment in the United States today, then the argument about the external deficit in the United States being a gift to U.S. consumers, is only part way true.
Yeah, Keynes became a protectionist in the 30s.
Sorry?
Keynes himself, who was once a very strong free trader, found himself advocating protectionism in the 30s. Something I find mysterious and strange, but yes, it's an argument.
It made sense. It made sense within that logic, and it's still. So
without retaliation and
Well, there's the coordination problem, of course. Then if every country does that, so the argument here would be, it would be far better to reach an agreement with China on the exchange rate front than have this kind of protection war. So, and you're right also that this is, even under normal circumstances, is a bigger issue for developing countries like Mexico because, for them too, the structure of production matters. You might say, well, let them deal with better labor market policies. But I think, one thing that I've learned working on developing countries is that you can't, you are always in a second best world, and sure. I think often we just say pick the first best, and that just becomes it's often escapism because you are inherent in a second best world. Given that is not the only distortion you're talking about, everything is entangled with something else, and often the reforms that work best are those that are second-best reforms that tend to sort of isolate some adverse second-best interaction that would have happened somewhere else in the economy and so forth. So you have to be more pragmatic there and not simply say, well, just do the first best.
I don't know. When it's that complicated, I'm not sure what pragmatic means. But let's go to the United States because you said something a few minutes ago that you hear people starting to say about the United States, which I find a little bit strange, but it certainly is parallel, which is that the sectors that are growing in the United States recently, that has been, say, the technology sector, they're not very labor intensive. Google and Facebook, the most dramatic successes in the technology area, they hire tens of thousands of people, but they don't hire much more than that. So the people ask, where's the new employment going to come from? How much do you think our our anemic labor market recovery as part of the recovery from the recession is structural versus other possible explanations? It's just that, we put a whole bunch of people into housing. We pulled a whole bunch of people into housing between 1995 and 2005. That was easy. The world went along kind of well. Then we tried to, unfortunately, all of a sudden the economy found itself with too many carpenters, electricians, and drywall applicators, and they had to find something else to do, and they seem to be struggling to do it. What's going on? Any ideas?
No, I think that there's definitely that structural misallocation given what the U.S. economy has inherited. So there's definitely a need for a structural adjustment going forward, and definitely growth is going to be slow until you get that readjustment accomplished. I do not study the U.S. economy, so I don't have a very good sense about this debate. I mean, I find it hard to believe that there is not an element of, Keynesian demand side problems when unemployment shoots up to that level. I'm inclined to believe that there is a Keynesian element in this, but it's more an impression and a guess than really based on substantive analysis.
Appreciate the honesty. It's good. I'm not sure anybody knows a lot about it, but you can certainly hear a lot more dramatic claims along either side. Let me first. I want to introduce a parallel, which is, and then I want to turn to some broader issues. One of the issues that's come up on this program before is that, in general, when people dump goods in the United States, free trade economists say that's good, but somehow when we dump in foreign countries, it's not good. And why isn't the logic the same? And really what we've been talking about today, for those out there who remember those earlier discussions, is that when labor markets don't work very well, for whether it's government or market issues, some of the standard conclusions of trade policy may not be as similar in poor and rich countries. And I just want to make that parallel, which I think is very interesting. The general question I want to ask you is about globalization. Partly in the current climate we're in, which is one of not so healthy economic activity, high unemployment in lots of countries. Where do you think globalization's headed? Where do you think it ought to head? You are renowned as a skeptic and a contrarian on trade issues. Try to give us a summary of what you think are important. What do you think is important in these areas for both policy and what do you think is happening?
I mean, I think we've come out of the crisis with a sense that you need much better regulation. For example, for financial markets, that financial globalization has gone beyond the regulatory infrastructure that you needed to sustain it. And that therefore you need to complete that regulatory infrastructure. So we have efforts in the G20, the Basel Committee, and the Financial Stability Board, and the IMF, and so forth. And I just don't see. I mean, if you just use the analogy with domestic financial markets, sort of we've learned, after centuries that they just need. Whole alphabet soup of regulatory authorities that we're still fine-tuning to try to get it straight. And behind all of that, there is, a whole political structure and so forth, and just extend that logic to the global level. And there's no way we're going to get anything like the global equivalent of the kind of domestic regulations that we have to sustain domestic finance. Given that, either we're going to get regulations at the global level that will be very weak and effective, won't serve us at all until the next crisis, or we'll get sort of like the lowest common denominator, so because that's the only one that you can get countries to agree to. So I think that's the path that we are moving down. We're so obsessed at ensuring that we minimize transactions costs associated with national borders in global finance. That we need to coordinate and harmonize to the extent possible at the global level, and I find that I just think that's a dead end. Now, if you agree with me, then that's a dead end, and the only alternative is to really have a global financial system that allows much greater diversity and discretion at the national level in terms of how these rules are set. So, some countries may set their capital requirements at 20%, other countries might set them at 10% because they want to be on a different point in their sort of, financial innovation versus financial stability frontier. And I think we should allow that. The problem, of course, then becomes, how do you deal with the regulatory arbitrage that would arise from, different countries having different kinds of regulatory regimes. And there, I say, look, we should approach this issue in exactly the same way that we approach, let's say, our imports of toys from China. When we import toys from China, we say they better abide by U.S. health and safety requirements. That means that if they do not conform to, let's say, lead content requirements, then those goods don't come in. Finished. And there's not even a debate about that.
Right.
And I don't think there's any difference with financial markets. Our rules should be the same, that any financial institution that wants to operate in the U.S. jurisdiction ought to operate by the rules set in the United States. And in order to maintain those rules, the integrity of U.S. rules, you ought to then allow U.S. and other countries to interfere or tax or otherwise control cross-border financial flows to ensure that their regulatory systems remain, their integrity isn't eroded. So it's a somewhat very different conception of where we ought to go. But I think it's really, frankly, the only realistic one.
Yeah, so we don't allow toxic toys. We shouldn't allow toxic assets.
Precisely.
But let me partly agree with you and then partly disagree. I agree with you that the harmonization thing is a bad idea for a different reason. Maybe we agree on this. We actually have had quite an extraordinary global financial infrastructure. Basel I and Basel II were the products of thousands, millions, I don't know how many hours of work by experts. Now, you could argue, well, we just didn't get it right. The next time we'll get it right. And I would argue that it's not designed to be gotten right. It's a process that's inherently going to be run by the people with the biggest stakes and the most information. Those would be international financial firms. Why would you expect them to give inputs to the political process that would be good for the world rather than good for them? It's just, if anything, going to a globally harmonized system, and this is true for accounting and all kinds of other things, the claim is made that it's going to save all these transaction costs. It could, but there's no reason to think that would be the way the system would be designed. I would assume it would be designed by politically powerful people to benefit themselves. So given that there's no accountability, who do we blame for Basel II that didn't work so well? Who do we get mad at? Who loses their job? Nobody. So there's no reason to think that Basel III, with a bunch of even well-intentioned people, would do better. Basel IV, whatever we're at.
I agree with you 100% on this. I think this is the problem that we've had with the system, that economists tend to think that if you sort of, by moving these decisions from the national level to these, global fora, you have depoliticized the decision making, and therefore, but as you say, all that you've done, you've just privileged one set of interest over everybody else. And that's exactly how the system has worked. That's exactly how the system is now working with Basel III. That's why I actually think that you should politicize the system.
I agree.
That's why it should be, at the national level where, the whole full course of politics can play out. And that's, again, sort of an argument that's pushing in that direction.
How about goods and people, though?
I'm sorry?
How about... You answered my question with answered my question with respect to financial flows.
There, it's very clear. In goods, I think we've eked out most of the benefits from further liberalization. We're wasting a lot of political capital at huge costs in terms of legitimacy and so forth, and I think quite some legitimate concerns about what the distributional burdens that are suffered. In people, we're sort of like where we were with the trade regime in the 1950s, which is a huge amount of gain to be had. So, I want to sort of see all those trade negotiators in Geneva stop talking about the current Doha agenda. Let's start talking about negotiating an expansion of temporary work visa schemes around the world where the gains are huge.
My guest today has been Dani Rodrik. Dani, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Nice to be with you, Therese.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.